Judge Thomas Williams was known for his no-nonsense attitude in the courtroom. He had built a reputation over the years as someone who valued order and efficiency above all else. He didn't tolerate disruptions or delays, and his decisions were swift and firm, often making him a figure of authority in the town. He had become the kind of judge that lawyers and citizens alike respected, even feared at times. He never second-guessed his rulings, always confident that he was doing what was best for the system. Monica Johnson, on the other hand, had been a part of the courthouse system for much longer than anyone realized. She had worked tirelessly behind the scenes for years, ensuring that the wheels of justice turned smoothly and efficiently. Her role as senior administrator meant that she was the one making sure things ran without issue. Even though her work often went unnoticed, she took great pride in it. She had a quiet strength about her and was known for her dedication and precision. But despite her important position, few of the courthouse's more visible figures really knew her. She wasn't in the spotlight, and she didn't mind it that way. That particular day, Monica had arrived at the courthouse with a long to-do list ahead of her, the usual administrative tasks piled up like they did every morning. But there was one thing that stood out. She had an appointment later that afternoon with a team of court officials to discuss an upcoming project, a task that had been consuming her time for weeks. She had been up late the night before making sure the plans were flawless, and while she had hoped for a smooth day, she was still rushing through her list of things to do when she found herself caught in a minor traffic situation. Monica didn't often pay attention to the finer details of her driving. She was always too focused on getting to work and getting things done, but today it was different. As she turned the corner, a traffic officer had been waiting nearby, and she didn't see him in time. Before she knew it, she was receiving a citation for something that felt like such a small issue. In her otherwise busy life at the time, it didn't seem important, but later, when she realized she would have to go to court, she began to feel a bit of frustration building inside her. The case was a simple one, a minor infraction, one she knew would probably not require much attention, yet the thought of having to take time out of her day to address something like this felt unnecessary. She had bigger things to worry about, but she knew the system worked in ways that couldn't always be avoided. And so it was that the next day, she found herself entering Judge Williams' courtroom to resolve the matter. As she walked into the courtroom, she didn't immediately recognize the judge's face. She had seen him around the courthouse before, but their paths had never crossed directly. She had no idea how powerful his presence was in the courtroom. She just knew he was the judge who would determine the outcome of her case. And with that in mind, she stood ready to address him, not knowing how their interaction would change the course of both their lives. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft rustling of papers as Judge Williams looked over the case files before him. His expression was neutral, but there was an underlying sense of authority in the way he moved, as if he had seen every type of case imaginable and knew exactly how to handle each one. Monica stood at the front of the room waiting for her turn. She had been in courtrooms many times before, but this felt different. There was something about the formality of the place that made her uneasy today. She wasn't behind a desk. She wasn't managing paperwork. She was the one who had to speak. She glanced around the room, noticing the familiar faces of the court staff who worked alongside her every day, though none of them seemed to recognize her in this moment as anything more than just another person with a minor issue to resolve. The judge finally looked up from his papers, and his eyes met hers. There was a brief moment of recognition on his face, but he quickly masked it with his usual professional demeanor. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice steady and composed, "I see you have been issued a citation for a traffic violation. Can you tell me your side of the story?" Monica straightened up and cleared her throat. She had been prepared for this moment. She knew exactly what to say. She spoke calmly and clearly, explaining that she had been running errands during a break from her administrative duties. When the incident happened, she wasn't making excuses, just giving the facts. She went on to explain that she had been in a hurry to return to the courthouse and had not noticed the traffic officer nearby. She was not trying to evade responsibility. She had simply been caught up in the flow of the day, as most people were at times. Her tone was respectful, but there was an underlying frustration she couldn't quite hide as she stood there explaining something that felt so trivial in the grand scheme of her life. Judge Williams listened carefully, nodding along as she spoke. His expression was unreadable. He didn't interrupt or show any indication of what he was thinking, But when she finished, he gave a small sigh and looked down at her file once more. It wasn't a big deal to him. It was a straightforward case, and he had dealt with far more complicated ones without hesitation. "Thank you for explaining your situation," he said after a moment. "However, I still find that the fine is necessary to encourage adherence to traffic regulations." He looked up and met her eyes as he spoke, as if trying to make his reasoning clear and final. "I will issue the fine as scheduled." Monica nodded, though she felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. But she said nothing. She knew that arguing would only make it worse. With that, the decision was made, and she was dismissed. The judge gave her a polite nod as she turned to leave, but the air between them had shifted. There was something about the way she had been treated that didn't sit right with her, but she held her tongue, leaving the courtroom with the weight of the fine now hanging over her. As she walked out into the hallway, she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. The whole process seemed unnecessary. She had hoped for some understanding, but instead she was just another name on a list, another case to be dealt with, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than just a routine court session. Weight of the situation, highlighting Monica's frustration and the judge's detached professionalism. The days after the court hearing felt like a blur for Monica. She went about her work with the same focus and determination as always, but there was an unease that lingered in the back of her mind. The fine seemed so trivial in the grand scheme of things, yet it had left a mark on her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being judged so harshly over something so small. She had expected a bit more understanding, perhaps even a little empathy, but instead she had received the full weight of procedure. As she walked through the courthouse the next morning, her thoughts were still preoccupied with the fine she had received. She had a full schedule ahead of her. There were meetings to attend, projects to manage, and countless small administrative tasks that needed her attention, but none of them seemed as pressing as the sense of discomfort that followed her from the courtroom. She turned the corner of the main hallway as she headed toward her office when she almost bumped into a tall figure coming the other way. It was Judge Williams. She froze for a moment in surprise. He was walking briskly as usual, but when he saw her, his pace slowed and his eyes flickered with a brief hint of recognition. Monica had seen him around the courthouse before, but their paths had never crossed directly until now. She had never really paid attention to him before, except for the occasional formal nod in passing, but today there was something different in the way he looked at her. His gaze held a mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place. She smiled politely and greeted him in passing, but he hesitated for a second before responding. His voice was cordial, but there was an awkwardness to it that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," he said, nodding briefly as they both moved to continue on their respective ways. But Monica couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. She felt his eyes linger on her just a second too long, as if he was trying to place her face, and in that moment she realized with a small shock that he probably didn't know who she was. Not really. He had seen her only as just another citizen in his courtroom, the woman who had been fined for a traffic violation and who had left without making any fuss. But that was the thing. She wasn't just another person. She was someone who worked in the courthouse, someone who had a far more significant role than he probably realized, and it dawned on her that Judge Williams had likely never seen her in this light before. As she continued down the hallway, a small knot of unease tightened in her chest. It was an odd feeling, something she hadn't expected when she had first entered the courthouse that morning. But now the realization was inescapable. Her interaction with Judge Williams wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was just beginning, and what had seemed like a simple court hearing was slowly unraveling into something much more complicated. Monica didn't know why, but she felt a flicker of discomfort at the thought of how Judge Williams would react when he eventually realized who she was. She wasn't sure what he would say, what he would do, but she had the strange feeling that whatever came next would not be easy for either of them. The realization hit Judge Williams hard as he sat at his desk later that afternoon, flipping through the case files in front of him as he prepared for his next hearing. His mind kept drifting back to Monica Johnson. He had seen her many times before, but never truly paid attention to who she was beyond the occasional polite greeting or quick nod when their paths crossed in the courthouse hallways. But now he couldn't shake the thought of her from his mind. He recalled her calm demeanor in the courtroom, her clear and respectful explanation of the situation. Despite the frustration he had sensed beneath the surface of her words, it had been a small issue, nothing significant to him. But something about the way she had spoken, her quiet confidence and professionalism, made him pause for a moment longer than usual. He realized he had dismissed her too quickly. He had assumed she was just another citizen, dealing with a minor infraction without thinking much of it. Then the encounter in the hallway came rushing back to him, the way she had looked at him with a kind of knowing calmness that made him feel suddenly out of place. It was as if she had recognized something in him that he hadn't recognized in her at the time. But now it was clear, he was certain now, that the woman he had found so effortlessly, the woman who had left his courtroom quietly with a slight hint of frustration, was none other than Monica Johnson, senior administrator of the courthouse and his superior. His stomach churned as the implications began to set in. How could he have been so unaware? How could he have issued a fine to someone in such an important role, someone who essentially helped run the very system he worked in? He felt embarrassed and uncomfortable with himself. He had spent so many years in his career thinking of himself as a figure of authority, a judge who was always right and in control, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it felt like a fundamental misjudgment. What was worse was that Monica hadn't said anything about it. She hadn't challenged his ruling or tried to make an issue of it. She had simply accepted the fine with grace and left the courtroom, but Judge Williams couldn't help but wonder what she must have thought when he handed down the decision. Had she been disappointed in him, or did she view him as just another cog in the system, no different than any other judge who followed the rules without question? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had let his own rigid adherence to rules cloud his judgment. He had seen her as just another person who had broken a rule and needed to be punished, without considering who she really was, what her position meant, and how his decision had affected her in a way he had never imagined. He had failed to treat her with the respect she deserved, not just as a citizen, but as someone who played a vital role in the very system he worked within. Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew he had to do something to make things right, but he wasn't sure how to approach Monica. He wasn't sure if he could simply walk up to her and apologize for his mistake, or if it would be better to wait for her to bring it up first. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let this go. He had to find a way to show her that he understood the gravity of his mistake and hoped that they could move past it in a way that restored the respect that had been lost between them. The days passed, and Judge Williams couldn't shake the nagging sense of discomfort that had settled in his chest. Every time he saw Monica walking through the courthouse halls, his mind raced with thoughts of how to approach her, how to fix what he had so carelessly broken. But he found himself frozen, unsure of the right words or the right approach. He didn't want to come off as insincere or dismissive, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't let the situation fester. The quiet tension between them was palpable, and it was beginning to affect the way they interacted in their professional environment. One afternoon, as he walked down the hallway after a meeting with fellow judges, he spotted Monica standing near the elevators, her attention fixed on a file in her hands. It wasn't the first time they had crossed paths since that day in court, but this time there was something different in the air. He could sense it, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that they both knew something needed to be addressed. Monica looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Williams said, his voice measured but carrying an edge of hesitance, "could we talk for a moment?" Monica's expression softened, but there was a guarded quality in her eyes. She nodded, folding the file under her arm and walking toward him with her usual calm demeanor. She didn't speak at first, giving him the space to say whatever it was he needed to say. Judge Williams felt a knot form in his stomach as he took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about what happened in court," he began slowly, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting her eyes again. "I've realized that I handled the situation poorly. I didn't take into account who you are and the position you hold here at the courthouse. It was an oversight on my part, and I want to apologize for that." Monica blinked, her expression still unreadable, and for a moment, Judge Williams feared his words had been too late, that she might dismiss his apology outright. But then she spoke, her voice steady and thoughtful. "I appreciate your apology, Judge," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But I'm not sure it's just about the fine. It's about how you treated me in that moment. You treated me like just another person in your courtroom, someone without context or relevance beyond the case in front of you." The words stung more than he had expected, and he felt his face flushed slightly. He had known there was more to it than just the fine, but hearing her say it out loud made it clear how much his actions had affected her. "I didn't think about it that way," Judge Williams admitted, his voice quiet. "I was so focused on the rules that I didn't stop to consider the person behind them." "You're right, I was wrong." Monica studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "It's easy to get caught up in the structure of things," she said finally. "But you need to remember that the people we deal with, no matter their position, are still people. We all have lives outside of the courtroom. I'm no different." There was a moment of silence as Judge Williams processed her words. He nodded slowly, the weight of the conversation sinking in. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'll do better." Monica's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. That's all anyone can ask for. As she turned to leave, there was a shift between them, a sense of resolution that hadn't been there before. Judge Williams stood there for a moment, watching her walk away. He realized that this conversation, however awkward, had been the beginning of a new understanding between them. It wasn't just about making amends for a single mistake. It was about growing as individuals, learning from each other, and ultimately becoming better at their jobs as colleagues and as people. The following days passed by with a surprising sense of ease. While there had certainly been an awkwardness between Judge Williams and Monica in the aftermath of their conversation, there was also a quiet understanding that things were beginning to shift. The formality between them softened just slightly, but it was enough for both of them to feel a subtle, yet significant, change in the dynamic. Monica had noticed the difference too. Though she had initially expected the tension to continue, perhaps even escalate, there was something almost refreshing about how Judge Williams had approached their conversation. His apology had been sincere, and she could sense the genuine effort he was making to see things from her perspective. It wasn't something she was used to seeing in people who held such power. After all, many judges, like any figure of authority, could be stubborn and proud. But Judge Williams wasn't like that. Still, there were moments when the situation would weigh on her. She found herself walking past his courtroom a few days later, and for a moment, she hesitated, remembering the way he had handed down her fine without a second thought. That brief moment of uncertainty reminded her of how quickly she had been reduced to just another case, just another number. Yet there was no bitterness in her heart anymore. She had no desire to hold on to that feeling of resentment. She had seen enough of how the system worked to understand that sometimes people just got lost in the mechanics of it all. One afternoon, as Monica walked toward her office, she overheard a conversation between a few of the courthouse staff. She couldn't help but pause as she listened, something about the case files she had been reviewing earlier that morning. The more she listened, the more she realized that a major project she had been coordinating was running into serious trouble. There were some bureaucratic hurdles, mixed signals from higher-ups, and a growing sense that things weren't moving as efficiently as they should have been. As she processed the information, she began to feel the familiar pressure of responsibility weighing on her shoulders. She couldn't afford to let this slip. She had worked too hard to get to this position, and though she rarely sought the spotlight, she knew that when it came to important decisions, she was often the one who had to step up. Monica was a problem solver by nature, and her role in the courthouse required her to do more than just manage paperwork. She had to ensure that things worked smoothly, no small task in a place like this, where systems and people often collided. Without thinking twice, Monica pulled out her phone and made a quick call. She asked for an immediate meeting with Judge Williams, and though she hadn't anticipated needing his involvement, it became clear that his insight might be necessary. She wasn't one to ask for help often, but this was a different matter. The problem was bigger than her alone, and she knew it. Judge Williams agreed to meet her that afternoon. When he entered the conference room, there was a noticeable shift in his usual demeanor. He was still a judge, but now, in the space between them, They were colleagues working on the shared problem. There was no formality here, no courtroom hierarchy. "I've reviewed the situation," Monica began, gesturing to the piles of reports on the table. "And it's clear there are multiple issues at play here. We have a lot of overlapping tasks, and there's some miscommunication happening between departments. I need your perspective on." Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully, scanning the papers laid out before him. "This looks like a mess," he said, his voice tinged with frustration, but also a sense of resolve. "It's one of those things where everyone is so focused on their own parts of the process that no one sees the bigger picture." He paused, looking up at Monica. "But I see what you mean. There's a serious disconnect between the departments involved here." Monica leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room, her mind racing through potential solutions. This wasn't just about efficiency anymore. It was about the people depending on the system to function. The courthouse, the justice system itself, was being stretched thin, and they were at the epicenter of it. "Exactly," she said. "I've been going over these issues for weeks now, trying to find a way to bring everyone to the same table. But the bureaucracy is so tangled that it's creating delays, and those delays are putting everything at risk. Court dates are being pushed back, cases are falling through the cracks." She paused, meeting his gaze. "And that's not even the worst part. We're already dealing with a lot of stress in the courthouse, especially with staff burnout. I'm worried that if we don't fix this soon, it's going to get worse." Judge Williams rubbed his chin, deep in thought. The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. He was used to the pressure of cases, but he rarely saw the inner workings of the courthouse this clearly. He hadn't realized how far-reaching the inefficiencies were or how much stress the staff was under. He'd spent so much time on his cases that the administrative side had felt like something that just happened behind the scenes. But now, seeing the full picture, he understood why Monica was so concerned. "I'm willing to help," he said finally, looking up at her with a new sense of purpose. "But we need to get buy-in from the top. If we're going to address these communication gaps, it's going to take more than just the two of us pushing for change. We'll need the support of the higher-ups, and it won't be easy." Monica nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I've already started reaching out to some of the key people. The judges, the department heads, but they're all bogged down with their own tasks. It's like getting a room full of people to agree on the same thing, and everyone has different priorities." The challenge was clear. The solution wasn't going to be as simple as one meeting or a few calls. It was going to require patience, coordination, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. But Monica knew she was ready for it. She had always been someone who pushed for what was right, even if it meant going against the grain. "I think we need a task force," Judge Williams suggested after a moment. "Bring together a group of people who can focus on this full-time. Maybe pull some resources from other areas, court officers, administrators, even staff from departments that are less involved but still affected by delays. We need a broad approach." Monica's eyes lit up. "That could work. If we bring in the right people, those who understand how every part of the process connects, it could make a huge difference. It might even help with the burnout. People will feel like they have a voice in fixing things." Judge Williams smiled, a hint of approval in his expression. "I'm on board. Let's draft a proposal and get it in front of the right people. We'll have to sell it to the higher-ups, but if we present a united front and show them how this is a win for the entire system, they'll listen." Monica stood, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I'll start pulling together a list of people to bring into the task force. We'll need to move fast if we want to get ahead of the growing problems." As she walked toward the door, she turned back to look at Judge Williams. "Thank you for stepping in. I wasn't sure if you would, but it means a lot that you're willing to help make this right." Judge Williams looked at her with newfound respect. "We're colleagues, Monica. I should have realized that sooner. It's time we work together, not just on cases, but on everything else that keeps this place running." With that, they both left the room, a shared sense of purpose between them. What had started as an uncomfortable, tense interaction now felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that could change not just their working relationship, but the entire courthouse for the better. The task force proposal was met with surprising enthusiasm. Despite the initial resistance from some higher-ups, Monica and Judge Williams were able to garner support from the key players in the courthouse. The list of people who agreed to join the task force was diverse, bringing together judges, court officers, administrators, and even staff members from departments that had traditionally been on the periphery of decision-making. Together, they represented the full spectrum of the courthouse's inner workings, from the highest levels of legal authority to the people who made sure everything ran smoothly on a day-to-day basis. In the weeks that followed, the task force met regularly. What began as a series of tense, bureaucratic meetings slowly transformed into productive sessions filled with ideas and collaboration. Monica and Judge Williams found themselves in the center of it all, acting as anchors for the group as they worked through each issue systematically. It was a far cry from the impersonal nature of the courtroom and the rigid hierarchy that often defined their professional interactions. Here in these meetings, they were equals, two people with the same goal of improving the system. The first few meetings were difficult. Some people were skeptical about the task force's ability to make real change, while others were more concerned about the potential disruption to their daily responsibilities. But Monica's calm, measured approach to the problem, along with Judge Williams' steady leadership, began to win people over. They emphasized the need for open communication, a shared sense of responsibility, and a focus on long-term solutions. Monica's leadership skills shone during these meetings. She was able to listen to each department's concerns and find common ground where others saw only obstacles. She guided the group through difficult discussions, helping to break down barriers between departments that had previously operated in silos. As the meetings progressed, the task force began to identify clear goals and actionable steps. They addressed the communication breakdowns, streamlined certain processes, and even proposed a new approach to managing case backlogs that would relieve pressure on everyone involved. Judge Williams, though initially hesitant to step into such an active role outside of the courtroom, found himself increasingly invested in the success of the task force. He had always believed in the importance of fairness in the court system, but working alongside Monica and the other task force members made him realize how interconnected everything truly was. The decisions he made in the courtroom had a direct impact on the rest of the courthouse, and the broader systemic issues often went unnoticed by those who weren't directly involved in the administrative side. His perspective had broadened, and he was committed to seeing this through, not just for Monica, but for the entire courthouse. One afternoon, as the task force gathered for a crucial meeting, Monica stood at the front of the room, presenting a draft of the proposal they had worked so hard on. The room fell silent as she outlined the key changes they had made to streamline operations and reduce delays. She spoke with conviction, highlighting the need for a cultural shift in how everyone approached their work, from the highest-ranking judges to the clerks and officers. As she finished, there was a brief pause before one of the senior administrators spoke up. This actually makes sense," he said, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and approval. "I can see how these changes will make a difference. But what about the implementation? How do we ensure that everyone follows through?" Monica smiled, recognizing the pivotal moment. "We need continued buy-in. That means not just from the leadership, but from every person in the courthouse. We'll need regular check-ins, feedback loops, and most importantly, patience. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if we stay committed, I believe we can do it." Judge Williams nodded, his voice strong and sure. "We're all in this together. It's time to change the way we do things, to make this courthouse not just a place where justice is served, but a place where we all work together to make it work better." The task force members exchanged looks of agreement. The momentum was building, and they could feel the shift in the air. For the first time in a long while, the courthouse felt like a unified system, working toward a common goal. It wasn't perfect, but they were on the right track. As the meeting concluded, Monica and Judge Williams exchanged a quiet glance, a moment of shared satisfaction. What had started as a small, personal conflict over a traffic fine had evolved into something far greater, something that could truly transform the courthouse and the way it functioned. They had not only worked through their differences, but together they had ignited a spark that would lead to lasting change. As they walked out of the conference room, Monica turned to Judge Williams, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Judge Williams chuckled softly, his eyes filled with respect. "Yes, we have. And this is just the beginning."